Alright, so for today's video I'll be putting two of FNAF's not really main villains, but very important side antagonists up against each other. Those being the shadowy spawn of suffering and dark reflection of Afton, Nightmare. Versus a manipulative and homicidal AI born from a desperate man trying to regain what was taken from him, the Mimic. These two have both worn many faces throughout their various appearances, with both these characters both being somewhat similar in their roles in the series. Not necessarily the main villain, but definitely one that remains memorable, and one that leaves their mark on the series. One a Terminator-esque cybernetic killing machine wearing the face of William Afton, and the other a nightmarish monstrosity born of William Afton's own evil. These two are both connected to William, but in very, very different ways. And though these two likely somewhat know of each other, as Nightmarion, a evolution of Nightmare, is present during the events that the Mimic would be in, it's unlikely they've ever actually met until now. Some ground rules before we even get into this comparison. I will be using both of these characters at their maximum level of power, meaning Nightmare will be at his best. So feats from Shadow Freddy, Nightmarion, and any other entity that is believed to be Nightmare will be used here. Well, any other entity believed to be Nightmare that can be at least somewhat backed by actual canon material. And as for the Mimic, though I will be using the Mimic we see in Ruin, I will also be cross-scaling it with the Secret of the Mimic, as logically it should be at least on par, if not stronger, than that Mimic, due to it also being Burn Trap in most versions of the story that people believe now. So the energy amp Burn Trap got would likely still apply to the Mimic here. Also, its better feats are from Ruin regardless, so yeah. I'll be using a kind of composite of every single version of the character that's canon for the most part. Besides FNAF World, I will not be using Nightmare stuff from FNAF World. I will reference voice lines from FNAF World for characters believed to be Nightmare, as those should still somewhat apply to the main series. But I will not be using the abilities from FNAF World, as although he likely might be capable of some of them through his agony hacks, it just wouldn't be fair to use FNAF World stuff for one character and not the other for this comparison, as Mimic really doesn't have anyone he would scale to in terms of abilities in FNAF World, despite him, if he was in FNAF World, logically he would have some pretty OP stuff. I also won't be going as in-depth with calcs and stuff along those lines, as these two characters are from the same series, so you don't really need to be all that complex on who scales to what specific calculation when they're literally just scaling to the same feats. So if one feat is blatantly more impressive than another feat in a series, then you can kind of just say, then yeah, the character that scales to the better stuff inverse is the stronger character. Obviously this fight has a lot more to it than just strength and speed though, as with most FNAF matchups, hacks and other things also play a massive role here. Starting off with the Mimic, for this I'm going to be giving the Mimic access to pretty much every suit it normally would have access to. Now, one quick thing to point out, I do not believe that the Mimic is the White Tiger from Secret of the Mimic. Main reason is they both pop up at the same time, and the theory that Tiger Rock is actually Edwin's son makes a lot more sense to me personally, given its abnormal and paranormal abilities, as well as the child laughing noise you hear and its similarities to Golden Freddy. So here I'm going to assume that. Now, even if Tiger Rock was the Mimic, all this would really do for the Mimic is grant teleportation and potentially some shadowy hacks and stuff, but nothing that would drastically change this fight. So with that in mind, the Mimic would have access to quite a few extra abilities, such as suits that let it extend its limbs, as well as suits that grant it some limited shock abilities and other amps that it can apply to itself. Granted, these suits are a lot less durable than it itself is, and can be destroyed. It also tries to mimic the personalities of what it's wearing 9 times out of 10, which could potentially actually backfire at it. Now I should mention I'm bringing both M1 and M2 into this, meaning that Glitch Trap and the base Mimic are both involved in this fight, and can actively help each other out. However, for Glitch Trap, I am not allowing Glitch Trap to be able to have a bunch of like animatronics to possess nearby. Glitch Trap is there present through a couple, let's have the machines on the side or something, but not actually capable of jumping into the fight unless something that it can hack pops up. However, this does grant some mild hacking hacks to the Mimic as well, which is pretty decent, but Nightmare is not a mechanical being despite his appearance, so it doesn't really matter against him. That said, the Mimic doesn't necessarily need to hack opponents to do extreme damage. It is one of the strongest entities in FNAF, period. Definitely when it comes to physicals, at least. As this thing can go toe-to-toe with the Tangle, one of the most powerful things in FNAF in general. The Tangle is essentially an ungodly amount of animatronics and agony all stuffed together into one entity. Essentially Molten Freddy on roids, which is a pretty terrifying thought given that Molten Freddy was already one of the strongest animatronics prior to Security Breach. So I feel I should mention that the Mimic did not win its fight with the Tangle, nor did it really match it 1-to-1. It definitely held its own. I mean, it survived, as it's widely believed that the Mimic is Burn Trap, and there's a lot of stuff in games, such as Burn Trap's claw marks popping up both in the cave that the Mimic got trapped in, and in his main room in Ruin, where he is no longer in it. This didn't happen in Security Breach, which implies that this happened in Ruin exclusively, as well as the only arm on the Mimic that isn't 1-to-1 with Burn Trap, being the arm that was apparently lost during that cave-in, the same arm that made that claw mark, and the replacement arm being from one of the suits that was locked in there with it, which is backed up by the Mimic being able to use replacement parts from other animatronics to basically repair itself. So though the Mimic isn't 1-to-1 with the Tangle, it's in the same ballpark, which is pretty impressive, given that the Tangle can rather casually cause earthquakes. Small temporary earthquakes, but that's still enough to get it to town level pretty comfortably. And it's able to burrow around the Pizzaplex with so much power it gets into multi-city block, which is all pretty impressive and some of the highest scaling for FNAF physicals. Of course, there's already stuff in earlier games that gets to building level and even higher, but the Mimic would also just upscale, as the Tangle is obviously the strongest animatronic in raw physicals up to this point. So the small building, and wall level stuff from both the novels and games for earlier animatronics like the OG crew doesn't really matter here, as the Mimic is already well above all of that. This is backed up by the Mimic being able to swim through lava, and this lava was able to melt straight through a steel wall with the Mimic still there. In fact, the Mimic was the one that was melting through it. And the Mimic's able to absorb energy during its brief time as Burn Trap, enough energy to actually cause problems in the Pizzaplex, which would imply it's a higher amount of energy than the energy the FNAF 1 animatronics can absorb, which is already in the building ranges. So yeah, you could argue some pretty insane stuff off that. The Mimic would also probably have some very limited hacks based around agony. I doubt it has good agony at all, but there is some theories that imply that the Mimic itself has agony. Mainly M1, but M2 would have this too, as the agony would be part of the suit. Same with the Remnant, that's potentially part of it. However, as far as control goes, I don't think it has very good control of agony or Remnant at all. In fact, I think it's probably the least hacksy user of it, if it even has it to begin with, in the entire series. The Mimic also does have one pretty bad anti-feat, and that is that Edwin Murray was able to break its legs. Yeah, that's kind of a plot hole, if I'm being completely honest, but Edwin Murray, you can kind of just argue, would be like Afton, and by that I mean abnormally strong, as Afton has some stupid stuff like that too. So you can kind of go that route, or I guess you could argue that since the Mimic was off guard and pretending to be a child and in its weaker, smaller form, maybe that nerfed its durability somehow. I don't know how that would work, but you could argue that, I guess. Regardless, though, this either just means that there's another superhuman in FNAF, because FNAF has those, or that the Mimic's durability isn't as good as its AP. But I personally don't believe that, as it takes hits way harder than a human hitting it in both Secret of the Mimic and Rune, and is kind of fine by it. And its only real damage we ever see it take in either of those two games comes from already damaged parts, like its arm coming off in Rune. That arm was already broken. It already came off in a cave-in, so it was a replacement arm falling off at a crack, not the full arm. So I think it's kind of a plot hole, but regardless, I think most likely Edwin Murray is just like Afton and abnormally strong, or potentially was even amped by some form of agony from his emotions at this time, as FNAF characters can kind of do that, sorta. Regardless, though, I don't think the Mimic is a normal human with like a baseball bat victim or anything. I don't think you could break its kneecaps with a lead pipe. I think Edwin was just either built different, or it's just the Mimic was off guard and Edwin got really lucky. I should also point out the Mimic isn't dumb either. There are points where it might seem that way, but the Mimic is genuinely incredibly intelligent and very perceptive. It can mimic its opponents pretty easily, and has a lot of tricks up its sleeve to get the better of somebody. So I don't think it's dumb like it's sometimes portrayed in gameplay, but it's definitely not like the smartest thing in FNAF. There's some stuff going on with it that makes it kind of unstable. Regardless, though, I do think that Nightmare would struggle to deal with some of the strategies this thing could bring up, especially when it comes to a physical fight, as Nightmare really doesn't have as much to go on physically, as you'll see later. Of course, his hacks have some pretty good counters to this, but when it comes to a physical fight, the Mimic most likely has a massive edge here, at least at the start of it. Then when it comes to speed, I'm going to be pretty blunt, both of these two are probably fairly even. All we really know about the Mimic is it just kind of upscales everything up to this point, which would imply it's faster than the FNAF 1 crew at least. If not faster, then animatronics even stronger than that. It's kind of implied to be on the same level of speed as the Glamrocks, if not faster, so I'll just give it that same general tier. Whereas Nightmare would just kind of scale to other Agony beings, which are all consistently faster than the animatronics, but they're still considered in the same tier, at least in the books, in terms of speed. So I'm hesitant to give Nightmare a speed edge, especially with the amount of upscaling the Mimic would have. So for this, we're just going to kind of say it's even. Nightmare technically scales to more consistently high stuff, like nanosecond reactions. However, the Mimic upscales the other feats of characters that are usually on the same level, not like level of feats, but level of those other characters, like story-wise, to a much higher degree. So we'll just kind of even that out here. I should also point out that the Tangle just kind of upscales most Agony creatures in verse, as it itself is technically an Agony creature to a degree, and it is just like the strongest one thus far, for the most part, besides characters like maybe Eleanor. So most of the stuff Nightmare scales to as an Agony creature, the Mimic would scale to a physical degree for the most part, but not in a hacks degree. The Mimic wouldn't really scale to some of the more insane Agony hacks. I mean, it would scale to the level of powers in it in terms of raw physicals and durability and stuff, but it wouldn't be capable of mimicking those feats itself in any way, shape, or form. It also wouldn't be resistant to them by default just because the amalgamation is the strongest Agony creature, arguably, doesn't mean that it is capable of those levels of hacks, as we never see anything that implies this, outside of it maybe being an Agony creature, as it acts more bestial and more insane than most Agony creatures. Nightmare, we can kind of imply, is likely capable of a lot of the Agony feats that we see in the books and from other characters, as not only is he a lot more intelligent than the Tangle, but he's also a direct counterpart to Shadow Bonnie, who is implied to have some sort of pseudo-relativity to Eleanor, who is capable of pretty much all those feats, so he'd be in that same general classification of more intelligent Agony creatures. Whereas the Tangle really isn't, as it literally shows no hacks like that at all in its entire time in the series thus far. Now, I could be wrong and it could have all those hacks, but the Mimic still wouldn't be capable of mimicking those in any way, shape, or form regardless. And again, it doesn't really scale to the Tangle 1-to-1. It just kind of survived a brief fight with it. It does not scale to it fully, so it's unlikely it would have even been hit by any of those hacks if it does have those. Nor would it have even likely survived them. Of course, again, the Tangle is a lot stronger than Nightmare, so I'm not saying Nightmare one-shots, because the Tangle might be able to if it had those hacks. Just that the Mimic isn't going to be completely resistant to everything Nightmare has, just because it arguably scales a lot higher in verse. So, on to Nightmare, and well, Nightmare under the Nightmarian theory is kind of just three different things. Shadow Freddy, Nightmare, and Nightmarion, so three different entities within the FNAF series. This theory is backed up by a lot in verse, such as Nightmare being directly referred to as Shadow Freddy, and Nightmarion being directly referred to as Nightmare in two separate games, with Nightmarion's plush in Security Breach just being called the Nightmare plush, which kind of implies they're retconning them to the same character, which is backed up, well, not really retconning, but implying they're the same entity, which is backed up by Nightmarion taking Nightmare's place in a separate game, a game that has everything that is normally canon, but replaces Nightmare with Nightmarion, making Nightmarion canon to the main canon, actually. And Shadow Freddy has a lot of implications of being Nightmare. Not only is it directly called Nightmare, but we know that Shadow animatronics can mess with people's dreams, and Shadow Freddy not only just kind of mimics Shadow Bonnie and what it can do, so it would be capable of that, but also the fact that what we see from Shadow Freddy implies it's an Agony creature, and it also would kind of back up Nightmare being an agony creature, as well as Nightmare invaded most likely Michael Afton's dreams to kind of get stronger off his own agony, which is the current theory that a lot of people go off of, which is, again, backed up by a lot of stuff, especially with the FNAF movie currently being there to answer questions about the games, implying that Michael, albeit a different version of Michael, a different character, it's not really related to the main one, using sleeping pills to get leads on his lost brother. This is likely there to kind of explain why the Michael theory for FNAF 4 makes a lot of sense, especially in tandem with Nightmare being Shadow Freddy, as this would imply that Shadow Freddy invaded Michael's dreams while he was trying to get leads on his own father to find where William is to kind of stop him. And Nightmare was kind of either trying to stop him, which is backed up by Shadow Freddy kind of helping William Afton canonically, or was just feeding off his agony, or maybe both, which I feel like is backed up fairly well in verse with what little lore we have on the character. So that's the theory I'm going off of here. So I'm not calling Nightmare death like a lot of people think he is, and I'm not just thinking Nightmare is just a random illusion caused by sound or gas-induced hallucinations, as I feel that doesn't make sense given how different he is than all the others. And I also think that you wouldn't just call Nightmare Shadow Freddy in the game files if you know that the people that play these games read the game files for lore, if you didn't mean for them to be the same character. And I think Scott would actually think that through. I don't think he's the type to not think everything he does through for the most part. So off this, I am assuming that this theory is real and these three are the same things. So with all that out of the way, where does Nightmare even scale in verse? And while it depends on which point in the story you're talking about, currently I'd say he's actually a higher tier, but it relies on how many amps he would get throughout the series, which is quite a few. His first amp would come from fairly early on when he's first made. It's heavily implied that Shadow Freddy is made from the agony of the crimes that William Afton created, as well as William Afton's own evil. William Afton's evil doesn't necessarily fully scale to Nightmare, but he would scale to a fraction of the power of it, which is very important because William Afton's evil is described as pretty much infinite and unlimited, and it feels his agony to a degree, and this is what causes William to be capable of doing so much crazy stuff down the line. So off rip, Shadow Freddy isn't as strong as William, not really at all, especially William's like Springtrap, but he has a fraction of human William's power, which could put him either slightly under or at the level of FNAF 1 animatronics, as human William is stronger than them. Yes, I know that sounds insane. I have a whole video explaining why. And several other people do too. William Afton is not a normal guy at all in any version of the story. So if you want to see that, I guess go check those videos out. Now later on, he gets even stronger after William dismantles the FNAF 1 animatronics. It's likely he absorbed some of the agony from this event. Now, nothing really confirms this, but why else would he be helping William by luring them in if he didn't want some sort of power out of it? Everything Nightmare and his various interpretations and versions do is to gain power. So it's very likely Nightmare got an amp from this, taking a fraction of the power from each of the animatronics, boosting his power to a pretty significant degree. At bare minimum, I'd say this puts him on par with human William Afton, to maybe even slightly above him at this point in the story, as he's now even stronger. After this, it's likely he was present for William Afton getting spring locked. Why he didn't intervene is likely just because he knew he can get more power from it, or he knew he couldn't beat all of the children's spirits at once. Either way, we don't really know how loyal Shadow Freddy was to William. It's likely he was just using William, and William was just using him with their little alliance they had. And yes, it's implied that William knew about this to some degree, as Henry mentions that William set a trap and he doesn't know what type of trap he set. That trap was Shadow Freddy. So most likely William and Shadow Freddy had an actual alliance going on, meaning William literally had like a demon partner in crime to a degree, which is a pretty insane thought, but it's kind of backed up by official material. So off that, I guess Shadow Freddy just really wasn't that loyal to him, or didn't want to get the absolute dog shit knocked out of him by Cassidy and the rest of the group. So he just lets it happen and probably steals some agony from it. After this, he then invades Michael's dreams and starts draining and leeching off of him. This whole time he would have also likely been leeching off of William's own evil as well, boosting his power even further. It's also implied in FNAF World that Shadow Freddy can literally eat souls. So if he did that, which I don't think anything really proves he did, but if he was eating souls, that would obviously add more amps to him. Regardless, by the time of FNAF 4, I think he surpassed human William most definitely. Most likely Nightmare, as we see in FNAF 4, isn't quite on Springtrap's level, but could be. He's somewhere in between Human Aft and Springtrap, most likely, but a way more hacksy entity, as he's a full-on Agony creature. One that has William's own Agony, so he should be capable of similar stuff to what William himself can do. So that grants him insane hacks, which I'll talk about in the abilities, but that's after I go through all the other amps he gets, as he also gets amps throughout the FNAF Help Wanted games as well. While this can't really be 100% confirmed, I do believe Nightmare's also invading those games with Glitchtrap as Nightmarion to get more Agony. Or at the very least, he's taking Agony from it. Regardless, though, even if he didn't get these amps, which these amps wouldn't really be that big anyway, he would still get an amp from Security Breach, off a kind of shaky but very possibly real theory that Nightmarion is watching Gregory throughout the entire game. Why would Nightmare be at all interested in Security Breach in the Pizzaplex at all? The simple answer is, everywhere that we see Shadow Freddy and any version of Nightmare within the entire series, he is following where the most agony is at. So where's all the agony at during Security Breach? It's in the Tangle. More likely than not, Nightmare is actively leeching off the Tangle, and likely has been since the Tangle wasn't even the Tangle, meaning that throughout the other games, Nightmare is still likely present. As we know, Michael has seen Nightmare. He even shows this like officially that he's seen Nightmare, and Nightmare probably followed him to the sister location and to the Pizzeria Simulator. So Nightmare's probably been leeching off of Michael and other animatronics throughout all the games post FNAF 4, with the Tangle obviously being the biggest amp. Now, I'm not saying that he's on par with like top tiers in the series, but he should at bare minimum be one of the strongest Agony creatures we see in the series. So I don't think he's stronger than the Tangle or anything. He wouldn't have to leech off of it if he was. Nightmare is definitely stronger than a lot of people give him credit for by the end of the game off this theory, which I feel like is backed up by the games. Nightmare is simply leeching off of other characters, constantly growing in power. In other words, he's using the horrible events of FNAF and all the horrible things that happen to his advantage every step of the way. And unlike William, he has not been punished for it at all, and has never been stopped. He's been doing this since like FNAF 1, and he'll probably continue to do it indefinitely if he isn't eventually turned into a main villain and stopped outright. So I think Nightmare upscales most Agony beings within the main series, most definitely. So what does that mean for his hacks? Well, quite a bit. Nightmare could use his Agony to infect and control other non-living objects, as well as potentially even infecting people and messing with them as well. He should also have some form of soul decay and ability to stitch rates shows. I doubt his is as strong as the stitch rates, but it should still be the same general idea, meaning he could just decay your soul outright and like kill you that way. He should also have illusions, stuff along those lines. We know he can teleport, we know he can rip parts of his body off and just disassemble himself. Like other Agony beings, it's likely he could take extreme damage and just come back. And it's also likely he has some form of intangibility as well as flight, as he scales to the other shadows, which have both of those. And it's also likely that he can shapeshift his form. Not only does he kind of imply this through being 3 separate entities, but other Agony users can do this too. Eleanor being the biggest example of this. He should also have some form of like a realm ability like Eleanor has, where he can send you to a nightmarish place. It's unlikely he can just do this off rip, but it is something he likely has. He can invade dreams, obviously. He can mess with technology, and it's actually kind of theorized that Nightmarion might have been the thing that messed with Freddy's technology at the start of Security Breach. Though this isn't backed up by much, it does kind of make sense if that is what Nightmarion's going for, is to continue the cycle of Agony in FNAF. If Freddy would have just gotten taken over, Gregory would have died, the Pizzaplex would have just... the story wouldn't have continued after that. The Mimic would have just came back, and then it would have just been the end of the FNAF series. There would have been no point in continuing it, and it wouldn't have done, nothing would have happened after that. It's likely Nightmarion was just trying to continue the cycle of Agony. Of course, this theory isn't confirmed, and I'm not going to use that for the scaling chain, as that would actually imply that Nightmarion can mess with Glitchtrap's own hacks, which would kind of be strange, seeing that that doesn't really make sense on a scaling level, but I mean, there is a theory that implies that Nightmare has actually beaten Glitchtrap before, to a degree. So, off that, as well as tons of other hacks, like being able to summon storms and, like, just kind of insane stuff from the books that Nightmare might have, as well as some arguments that he might be capable of doing some of the FNAF World stuff that him and his other variants are capable of, I think Nightmare definitely takes abilities here by a wide margin. It's also important to note that he can eat souls and absorb emotional energies like Agony and Remnant to amp himself even further. Now, that doesn't really matter here, as he has no sources of that to really pull from, but it is something that is very important for other fights, especially against characters that use those energies against him, as literally nothing is stopping him from just taking them. I should also mention that both these guys also have just electricity drain. Nightmare should, as all the spirits in the games can do that, and the Mimic is blatantly shown to do this as Burn Trap. So, yeah, they are both capable of just draining electricity and power from anything nearby. Now, they do this differently. Nightmare probably drains it the same way the spirits of FNAF do, as in he kind of drains it through his own hacks and then just imbues it into his body, whereas the Mimic's just draining it like into his body directly. He doesn't need any supernatural abilities to do it, he just does it passively. Though, if he can do this without a charging pod is questionable. I'd say he likely can, but it's not really confirmed. Personally, I think the charging pod was just there to speed the process up, as clearly his body was also somehow absorbing it, and he is not a Glamrock model, so he's not designed to do that. Unless you believe he's designed like the older FNAF endoskeletons, which might be the case, but it's just a very strange topic. So both of them can absorb energy, but it's kind of iffy on how they do it. Nightmare probably does it the same way spirits do, but I don't know for sure, as he is an agony creature, not a spirit. Though they are kind of interchangeable in their abilities, Nightmare's hacks are notably different than something like, let's say, Cassidy or other spirits within the series, like the Puppet. Whereas the Mimic is technically similar to the animatronics in how it absorbs stuff, but it's not a spirit, it's an AI, so it would have to do it through a different method. So, how do I see this fight going? Really only one way, but it's not an easy fight. The Mimic in a physical match is obliterating Nightmare. It scales to entities that should just logically be on a higher plane than Nightmare is in terms of raw physicals. So if they were to come to blows, despite Nightmare being significantly taller, like almost twice his height off most estimates, he is still getting absolutely stomped in raw physicals. The problem is, Nightmare can just choose not to be in a physical form. He's an agony creature, so he can just take a spiritual state, like other characters like Shadow Freddy can. So if he does that, the Mimic literally cannot damage him. Nothing he has can damage a spiritual being. Of course, I doubt Nightmare is going to stay like that for the whole fight, and I'm not even sure he can do physical damage in that form, but he can use this to just avoid getting ripped apart right off the bat. And unlike the Mimic, even if he is completely destroyed, so long as his agony remains, which it will, as there's nothing really backs the Mimic being able to just drain that, Nightmare would just reform, most likely. Since agony beings are not really susceptible to the same damage a normal being would be. Now, once M1 sees that M2 is struggling with Nightmare, as Nightmare begins to simply out-hacks him and outlast him, as he cannot take permanent damage and can just avoid damage outright, whereas although the Mimic has better physical stats, he just can't contend with something that isn't taking damage and is dealing at least somewhat relative damage back to it, as well as hacks that kind of just bypass its normal resistances. M1's going to try to infect Nightmare, assuming it's an animatronic. However, even as Glitch Trap, M1 cannot directly affect a human soul, or at least has never shown that ability outright. M1 can infect a mind of a human, and can affect any sort of technology to a pretty insane degree, even overpowering the M2 code, but nothing implies it could directly affect a soul. So, or remnant for that matter, really. So off that, Nightmare would be pretty much unaffected. He doesn't have a mind, even if his endoskeleton kind of made it look like he had a brain. He doesn't have a mind to be infected, and he's not technically technology. He's a spiritual being that takes a technology-like form, but he himself has no code in him whatsoever. So he's going to be completely unaffected. However, Glitch Trap is not going to be uninfected at all, as Nightmare can and will invade technology with his agony. Now, I'm sure Glitch Trap can put up one hell of a fight against an agony invasion like that and even hold it back for a while, but eventually Glitch Trap is going to get infected with agony and is going to be corrupted by Nightmare. And probably destroyed. Once this happens, M2 is on his own, and M2 is not going to do very well. At this point, Nightmare is going to start draining power from M2. M2 cannot do the same to Nightmare, as although M2 can drain electricity and other powers like that, nothing implies it can drain spiritual powers like Agony and Remnant, which is all Nightmare uses. Nightmare will start draining power from him rapidly, converting it into Agony or something along those lines, while at the same time using his hacks to its full extent, while continuing to just wear down M1. Possibly trying to do the same thing he did against, M2, I mean. Possibly trying to do the same thing he did against M1 by infecting him with Agony, which he has no counter for. Over time, this will wear the Mimic down. Even with all those physical advantages and all the strength boosts and stuff that can just massively beat the shit out of Nightmare in melee, Nightmare's ability to just avoid damage, and also the fact that he has ways to just get away from the Mimic if he's taking severe damage, like teleportation and other stuff along those lines, like invisibility and his ability to just kind of warp reality to a degree and make his own realms, arguably, he's going to wear the Mimic down to the point where the Mimic cannot actually contend with him. And once this happens, Nightmare is going to infect the Mimic fully, and the Mimic's going to get a taste of its own medicine. Nightmare's going to take over the Mimic's own body and going to make it his own. And there's nothing the code can do against this, as there's nothing it can really do against Agony. Absolutely nothing in its arsenal is equipped to deal with this. So, off that, Nightmare wins. Sure, the Mimic is physically stronger, but he just lacks hacks. Like, completely lacks the abilities to keep up with Nightmare. And he lacks any sort of defense for most Nightmare's hacks. And he also lacks a way to kill Nightmare. He cannot put Nightmare down permanently. Yeah, he can ragdoll him like Thor vs. Loki if he gets real close to him, but it's not enough to kill him. And in that, Nightmare could actually hit the Mimic with his own medicine and start messing with his own code, while Nightmare is completely immune to both Glitch Trap and the Mimic. Yeah, it just doesn't go well for the Mimic. So, though Nightmare is definitely not the most powerful antagonist in FNAF, he can definitely contend with them. Anyways, the winner's Nightmare, in my opinion, of course. If you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.